The British East India Company wasn't just a trading business. By the 1700s, they were a messy corporate government violently grafting themselves onto ancient India. First up, the tax collectors turned warlords. Under previous Islamic rule, local managers known as zemindars were strictly held accountable as accountants, but the British failed to control them, allowing these managers to morph into untouchable, heavily armed warlords. Next, the debt trap. The company exploited local farmers, by demanding tax payments in cash right before the harvest. To survive, farmers had to borrow from predatory moneylenders, facing crushing interest rates of up to 5% every single month. Finally, the indestructible village. Every village operated like its own corporation, run by a local headman and an accountant. While the French, Mughals, and British violently fought for the nation, the average villager simply ignored the noise. The East India Company didn't build a new empire from scratch. They just pointed guns at the top of a self-sustaining society and violently skimmed the profits. When the British East India Company claimed South India's Northern Circars in the 1760s, they thought they had conquered a functioning state. Instead, they inherited an administrative nightmare. To extract their wealth, the British had to untangle 4 deeply broken layers of society. First, a massive misunderstanding of land ownership. The British treated local elites, called zemindars, as hereditary feudal lords, but they were actually just commissioned tax managers who had seized power during times of imperial weakness. Second, the indestructible Hindu village system. Daily life was governed by ancient, self-contained micro-republics. While vast empires rose and fell above them, these villages carried on uninterrupted, run by specific local officials from the headman to the boundary keeper. Third, a choked and catastrophic local economy. Corrupt tax farmers paralyzed trade with arbitrary tolls called sayer duties. They demanded protection money and taxed absolutely everything passing through, from basic grain to the weaver's looms. Finally, the total collapse of formal law. The old imperial courts had effectively vanished. Everyday justice was either settled informally by village arbitrators or handed out as brutal summary punishments by opportunistic military officers. The company's supposed grand conquest was actually an illusion. They didn't inherit a government. They inherited a fractured landscape ruled solely by entrenched local customs and opportunistic tax farmers. In 1765, the British East India Company acquired sovereignty over the Northern Circars, a massive coastal territory on the Indian subcontinent. On paper, they owned it. In reality, they possessed zero operational data about the interior of their new domain. For over a century, the company had operated as a coastal trading outfit. Its expertise lay in shipping logistics and warehouse management, not in governing millions of people across complex, hostile terrain. Corporate leadership in London assumed they could simply inherit the pre-existing tax infrastructure. They expected to slot their own executives into the top positions and immediately extract the regional wealth. Instead, the company's administrators encountered a rigid, impenetrable bureaucracy of local intermediaries who actively blocked British inspection. These entrenched local managers exercised total physical control over the regional population, and they held exclusive access to the economic ledgers the British desperately needed to calculate their anticipated revenue. A corporate state is functionally paralyzed when it legally owns a territory but lacks the information architecture required to audit it. This crisis is documented in the Fifth Report, an 1812 parliamentary investigation that served as a detailed autopsy of the company's administrative failures in Fort St. George. The records reveal a fatal British assumption. The company initially treated the local Indian power brokers, men known as zemindars, as if they were European feudal lords with rightful hereditary ownership of the soil. The document slowly proved that the zemindars were actually rogue bureaucratic tax collectors who had actively weaponized the tax code against the state. To understand the mechanics of this colonial failure, we have to reverse engineer the indigenous economic machine the EIC inherited and track exactly how British policies dismantled it. The British expansion into India was primarily a crisis of institutional engineering, where administrative stability mattered as much as military victory. The foundational unit of the pre-colonial Indian economy was the Hindu Village Corporation, a self-sustaining, deeply struggling system. This text from the Fifth Report outlines the base economic equation. Cultivators were legally entitled to 1/2 of the paddy produce and 2/3 of crops from dry grainlands. The remaining surplus was the property of the state. We can model this structurally. At the bottom is the ryot, at the top, the state. Between them sat the potail, collecting physical crops. Beside him, the kernum kept exact tax registers. Goods flowed through the potail, true information through the kernum, providing the state its accurate measurement of wealth. The British auditors eventually recognized the permanence of these aboriginal appointments, noting that earlier Islamic rulers had wisely retained the kernum and potail to maintain the agricultural baseline. The system survived for centuries because of its equilibrium. The separation of physical collection and data auditing created a mutual check on personal agency, preventing local officers from defrauding the cultivator or the crown. Moving from the single village to the provincial level, the territory was divided into 2 zones. The state directly managed the Havelis while farming out the administration of the peripheral borders. Here, the zemindar enters the hierarchy. The British initially treated these figures as the rightful lords of this territory. Historical records deconstruct this illusion. The office was originally called the Chowdhury and later the Crowry, a bureaucratic manager appointed to collect revenue on commission. Only late in the Mughal era did the term shift to zemindar, meaning possessor of land, giving these managers a false color of hereditary right. As the central Mughal authority weakened and collapsed, these regional tax managers exploited the power vacuum to operate as independent sovereigns. They consolidated this power by converting their administrative fees into funding for vast private armies. This text breaks down their highly structured military forces. They employed common peons paid in cash, alongside higher-order military tenants, compensated entirely through tax-free grants of state land. Protected by these heavily armed retainers, the zemindars completely severed the flow of the kernum's accounting data to the central government. The company assumed control of a mutated administrative architecture, an impenetrable armed information silo created by rogue middle management. Lacking the military capacity to break the zemindars by force, the company resorted to a catastrophic economic policy. They auctioned off the tax collection rights of the direct crown lands to the highest bidders. They inserted external speculators, debauches acting as stewards, and saukars acting as moneylenders, directly into the previously stable Havelis. The Fifth Report details the unqualified conveyance of powers to these large speculating renters, conferring upon them the most ample means of oppression. To maximize short-term profits, these renters bypassed or bribed village kernums. The data flow was corrupted, and the mutual check on the potails was entirely destroyed. Without the kernum's registers to defend them, cultivators were suddenly hit with arbitrary, unrestricted demands that ignored their traditional share of the crop. To pay these fabricated burdens, ryots were forced into a financial trap, borrowing from the same renters at extortionate interest rates of 3 to 5% per month. Both zemindars and renters then implemented a final economic chokehold, sayar duties, arbitrary internal taxes placed on the basic movement of goods. Under the heading of moterfa, the text describes taxes levied directly on the tools required to generate wealth: houses, agricultural implements, and manufacturing looms. By extracting maximal wealth without maintaining the rigid checks of indigenous institutions, the East India Company cannibalized the productive base of their own colony. Realizing their expected revenues were vanishing, the company deployed the Committee of Circuit, an auditing body tasked with penetrating the information blackout. The 1775 instructions from London demanded the committee acquire competent knowledge of the territory and map its actual production with all possible exactness. After years of delayed investigations, the committee discovered the mechanical reality. The vast majority of the region's agricultural wealth was being continuously diverted into the private accounts of the zemindars and the renters. The committee proposed immediate systemic reforms. They demanded the appointment of European superintendents, the absolute discontinuance of sub-renting, and the abolition of unauthorized taxes. But identifying a corrupted system on paper is a meaningless exercise if the governing body lacks the practical authority to enforce its reforms on the ground. The company faced an absolute barrier. As long as the zemindars maintained their private military establishments, the British could not safely execute detailed inquiries or enforce their new regulations. The East India Company was trapped. Their own depleted finances and the constant threat of neighboring sovereign states made it far too dangerous to attempt disarming the zemindars by force. This granular bureaucratic failure in the Northern Circars exposed the macro-level reality of the British foothold in India. The early colonial administration possessed just enough leverage to break the indigenous economic equilibrium, but lacked the capacity to build a functional replacement. It is a definitive lesson in institutional economics. You cannot regulate a revenue system or audit a territory without a true monopoly on the force required to open the books.